Welcome, everyone, to the Finding Elevation podcast. I'm very excited, beyond excited, to share my conversation with today's guest with you because he's an exercise physiologist. And as an endurance athlete, understanding our bodies and what's going on when we exercise and how to appropriately train for our goals is, I think, game changing. I did not grow up athletic at all and didn't really start training until I started climbing in about 2008. And that year I attempted Rainier, which is the highest mountain in Washington. I didn't summit officially because of the weather, but in reality, I was very relieved not to have to climb above 11,000 feet. And that's because I hadn't trained appropriately. I had basically just carried a really heavy backpack on some hikes and on the treadmill. I had done a little bit of strength training. Nothing was periodized. Thing was really dialed in for my goal. And I definitely did not think of that activity as an endurance event. And so, therefore, hadn't spent really any time working on building out my endurance or my cardiovascular capacity. And, I made all the other very common mistakes, like my backpack was way too heavy for that first Rainier attempt and mentally just wasn't strong enough to endure some of the challenges of that peak. And so I don't like to fail. And so after not summoning Rainier that year, I dug into studying sports physiology and in particular endurance. And this to me was a total game changer. And as an athlete, it changed the way I think about my sport. It changed the way that I train. And today, as a coach, it's fun for me to get to share that knowledge with other people, with the athletes that I coach, and to see those light bulbs go off for them and to see them, really start to fully step into training as a mountaineer. It's fun to see that click, which is why a couple of months ago, I was totally geeked out on a conversation with my guest. We have a couple of athletes that we both support. And so that's what initially introduced us. And so I'm very excited to share this conversation with you with Tom Cuddy. Tom is an exercise physiologist. As I said, he's also a coach. Business is called Calibrated Coaching, and he works out of Bozeman. He started that business with the intent to share this kind of metabolic and physiologic training with wider audiences to make it much more accessible. And today he's doing some work in the field so people don't necessarily have to come to his lab to get tested. He's also an endurance athlete, as you'd probably suspect. So he likes ski touring and mountain biking and trail running. In our conversation, we get into the fundamentals of what's going on when we exercise. We talk about metabolic testing, of course, and we dig into common parameters like VO2 max and lactate thresholds. And we also talk about how to use that information to make us better athletes. So I hope you enjoy our conversation. Here we go. Well, welcome. It's great to have you. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, when we initially spoke, I felt like there were so many questions I wanted to ask you and just little things I wanted to dig into more detail with. So I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. We will for sure get into lots of details about exercise physiology and the testing that you do, but maybe I'm curious what got you interested into sports physiology. How did you end up where you are today?
Yeah, it's a great place to start. So just like most kids, was super into sports growing up, did a lot of team sports like ice hockey, soccer, riding my bike, things like that. And then trying to figure out what I wanted to do for school, I was initially interested in becoming a physical therapist. And then, so I went to school at the University of Vermont and was in a program that most people go to and then go to physical therapy school. And I started taking some courses in exercise physiology. And I had an awesome mentor and professor named David Brock. And he was just very influential in my path. He was helped me kind of understand that this physiology route, which really sparked my interest, was something you could do as a career. And, you got into the lab and started doing things like we're going to talk about soon, like VO2 max testing and endurance training and all that stuff that I was at the time really finding pretty exciting.
Very cool. I find that understanding our bodies lets us be better athletes. And I'm
Hmm.
sometimes amazed at the people who, myself included early on, just go into your sport and don't really take the time to understand what's going on physiologically during that sport,
Yeah,
or maybe don't apply that understanding in a way that helps them develop or be better at whatever their chosen sport is. So, congrats to you for taking a passion and making it your business. That's incredible, and for helping other people in the process. So you do, through calibrated coaching, you coach people, but you also do a lot of physiological testing, performance testing for people.
right.
So, and I want to start there. And maybe, gosh, maybe we should just start with like physiology 101
Hmm.
and like ATP and what's really going on in our muscles and our bodies when we're at exercise. Do you want to give
Right.
us like a real short version of that?
Yeah, I think that's an awesome place to start. So, when we're thinking about exercise, we want to learn about the systems in our body that are operating so we can meet the energy demands of a certain task. So, let's say we're going on a run or riding a bike. We need to essentially fuel the muscle contraction, your heartbeats, your lungs working, just all those systems to support that activity. So, the fundamental of all of that is that we have a need for ATP. So ATP is our energy source that's going to fuel muscle contraction. And there's different ways that our body can produce this ATP. So I can run through just a couple of those systems
Yes.
to start
Yes,
off.
please.
Yeah. So we have the immediate energy systems. So this is where we're storing, either ATP right in our muscle, or we have something called creatine phosphate. And this is readily available. It's going to be kind of fuel or the energy system's working for very brief periods of time. So 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Once ATP, so the stored ATP in muscle, starts to run out, which happens almost immediately, creatine phosphate starts to kick in. There's about 5 to 6 times more creatine phosphate within working muscle compared to ATP. That'll get you through, like I said, about 10 seconds of exercise. So just kind of starting that run, just like those first few steps. And then as creatine phosphate starts to wear off, we're going to start to go through a different energy pathway. So the next one is sometimes referred to as our anaerobic energy system. We like to call it more specifically glycolysis, so the breakdown of carbohydrates. So with this next energy system, we are either burning through glucose that's circulating in our bloodstream, after we have carbohydrates, or we're going to break down something called glycogen. So glycogen is our stored form of glucose, and it's going to mostly live in working muscle and then a little bit in our liver. If we were going to isolate this glycolytic energy system, we might only be able to sustain that energy system for 20, maybe 30 seconds. And then after that, our aerobic energy system. So this is when we start to use oxygen to create ATP. And this is happening in the mitochondria of our muscle cells. So each of these different energy systems produce ATP at different rates. So, it might be within 10 seconds, we can produce a lot of ATP from creatine phosphate. And then our anaerobic, so glycolytic energy systems, can produce energy quite quick as well. But our aerobic system produces the most ATP out of all of those energy systems, but it happens quite slowly. So it takes a little bit for that to turn on, but most of our ATP is coming from our aerobic system. And we use these other systems for specific situations. So initiating exercise, that's more of our immediate energy systems. And then let's say we're going to do something high intensity, like we're going to accelerate up a hill. That's going to be more of our anaerobic system. And then our aerobic system, that's going to, fuel us for a marathon or hiking a mountain, like whatever it might be. And that can be sustained for a long period of time.
Because presumably we always have access to oxygen.
Correct. The aerobic system, just to make it kind of simple, is like it's like throwing a log on a fire. So it's a little bit slower to turn on, whereas our anaerobic system might be more of like throwing some sticks or some kindling on the fire. And then our immediate energy systems, that's like kind of striking a match. Our aerobic system, it might take 30 seconds, 60, maybe 90 seconds before it's fully operating and taking the whatever we're trying to fuel. It just takes a little bit to kind of turn on.
And then what I also find fascinating about our bodies is then depending on how much fuel we need for that activity, our bodies will alternate between these systems to get what it needs for I think of it as the intensity. So whatever the demands are of the activity that we're doing. And as endurance athletes, we spend most of our time in that aerobic phase, right? We say we've got enough fuel to create enough energy for that intensity. And so a lot of the training I'm sure we both do is to help athletes build out that part of their cardiovascular system for them as an endurance athlete. I want to talk about muscle fibers too.
Yeah, I think that kind of pairs well with this conversation too. So just to give a brief background on muscle fibers, in general, we have slow twitch muscle fiber and then two different types of fast twitch muscle fiber. And then there's some hybrid fibers that are kind of between each. So talking about slow twitch fibers, they're called slow twitch, not because they contract slowly, but because they fatigue slowly. So this is where we have the highest density of mitochondria, where that aerobic metabolism is happening. And they're quite dense with capillary. The capillary density is much higher, so blood flow can enter and exit those muscle fibers quite easily. These fibers are going to be, mostly used during low intensity, walking, light jogging, kind of depending on who you are. And then when we get into fast twitch fibers, we have fast oxidative. So that's called type 2A muscle fibers. So they still have a lot of that good mitochondria for aerobic metabolism, but they can also go and, burn through carbohydrates quite quickly. And then lastly is our type 2B or type 2X. So that's a kind of a pure anaerobic fiber where we might see like sprinters or power athletes having a little bit more of this. So the interesting part for me is that everyone's a little bit different in the different percentages of these muscle fibers. So typically endurance athletes, so like your traditional like marathoner or mountaineer, triathlete, they're going to have a really high percent of this slow twitch muscle fiber. So most of the exercise they're doing is they're using that fiber. And then moving into a little bit more of an explosive endurance athlete, we have, team sport athletes like soccer players or even mountain bikers. They might have a little bit more of that type 2A. So the fast oxidative fibers, because they require, repeated sprinting and some high intensity efforts that, a mountaineer or triathlete might not have to go through. Like I said, that would be like a sprinter or someone like that.
Yeah.
So everyone's a little bit different with each percent of those muscle fibers. And I think the coolest part is that we can train this. You have your own physiology that you're born with, but we're built to change. With different types of training, we might be able to improve how much slow twitch fiber we have, or maybe you want to be a sprinter and you really want to get more of that fast twitch fiber activated. So the types of training we're doing is going to influence the muscle fiber type of someone.
Yes. I am this point after decades of training as a mountaineer am 100% slow twitch.
Yeah.
Like if I had to change, in fact, a year or so ago, my dog like got loose and was running in traffic and I had to sprint after him. And I was like, oh
my
God, I'm
gosh.
just not made for this. I just can't do this.
Don't have a fast twitch fiber in your body.
Probably not.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to me. And I was reading an article recently about the composition of fibers that we have is genetic. Like you were saying, you're born with a certain physiology, but we can adapt it. We're meant to adapt. So you do a lot of testing. I would say what percentage of your work is coaching versus testing athletes that come into your lab?
I probably break it down as 50-50. So I have a pretty strict limit on how many coaching clients I take on because it's a lot of work to manage schedules and people's goals and all that. I certainly love that work, but I'd say my bread and butter is in testing, and it's not something that most people could have a full career off of only testing because it's starting to change. I think when I first got out of grad school, most people didn't really know much about testing. So when I would try to tell people about it, they would be like, oh, that's for elite athletes and not for me. But over the years, this type of testing has gained popularity from different books and podcasts and coaches out there talking about the application of this information. So the main tests I do are mostly VO2 max and lactate threshold testing. So I do this for a wide range of individuals, everywhere from elite Nordic skiers to clinical populations, maybe someone trying to improve their, let's say, diabetes, or they might have high blood pressure. So it's kind of a similar approach across all populations where we try and test to understand someone's physiology. And then once we have that information, we can start making recommendations of the specific types of training that might work well for them to work towards their goals and start to improve.
Science. I love it. So and maybe we can have another foundational conversation about some of those physiological markers or thresholds or things that you look at. So you mentioned VO2 max, which I think most people are familiar with, lactate as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot in terms of aerobic threshold. So what do you look for and what do you find most useful? And I, in particular, want to talk about VO2 max because I'm very conflicted about whether that's a good measure for an endurance athlete. We can table that question, but I want to get to that too. Someone's getting ready to climb Kilimanjaro and they want to make sure that they're really dialed in on their testing. They have, maybe did some collegiate sports, so they have a little bit of history as an athlete. What are the things that you look at for them? And then how do you use that data and that science to help them tweak their training?
Yeah. So maybe I'll talk about the testing protocol a little bit so someone can kind of picture this. So with a test, we're normally using a treadmill, a bike, or a rower, something where we can complete what's called a graded exercise test. So that means that we're starting someone at relatively low exercise intensity, and then we're gradually increasing their intensity to the point at the end of the test where they're at volitional fatigue, or they just can't keep up. They just tap out and they say, I'm done. So most of times where I'm testing, at least on the treadmill, we are doing a vertical test. So they're going to be running at a set pace. And then if we're also measuring lactate in addition to VO2, we're going to be spending several minutes at a specific intensity, and then we're going to slowly start to ramp up that intensity. So we might add like 1% incline on the treadmill, and then it just gets a little bit steeper and steeper. So while they're testing, we are having them wear a heart rate monitor, and then they have a funny mask on that is going to help us measure some of the parameters like VO2, ventilation, just kind of like how they're breathing oxygen, and then the volumes of air that are coming in and out. And then, like I said, so every few minutes, we're taking a blood measurement for something called blood lactate. So we do the test, and then we get all these metrics. So when you kind of brought up like, all right, is VO2 max actually a good measure for endurance athletes? So from my perspective, I never like to look at one variable in isolation. So speaking about VO2 max to start, so VO2 stands for the volume of oxygen consumption. And it's important to note that it's a rate of oxygen consumption. So we might express that as liters of oxygen per minute, or milliliters. And then most times we'll express that number relative to body weight. Someone might start the test and we're measuring their VO2. They might be around, if they're jogging, maybe 20 milliliters per kilogram of body weight. And then we're progressing their intensity throughout the test. And they might end the test at maybe 40, 50, 60, sometimes higher than that. And that would be their VO2 max at the end. So this number is going to be dependent on a lot of different physiologic systems that are working. So obviously your lungs are breathing in that oxygen, and then your blood vessels are taking that oxygen up and transporting that throughout the body. And then our heart is working like a pump to pump that blood to your working muscle. And then lastly, we already talked about muscle fibers. So certain fibers are going to take up that oxygen and then use it to create ATP. And that's what's fueling muscle contraction. So the VO2 is kind of like saying like, how big is your engine? Like how much oxygen can your body take from environmental air and transport to working muscle? I think I'll go into some of those other metrics kind of leading up to VO2 max, talk about some specifics. So you mentioned using some heart rate zones. So when we're at low exercise intensity, so let's say zone 1 or zone 2, we're going to be, it will hold a conversation. It's quite easy. And at that point during the test, we're going to be using slow twitch muscle fiber. We're going to be probably burning a mixture of fats and glucose. And then all of our energy is coming aerobically. So when that system of meeting the energy demands of the treadmill can no longer keep up, so we're starting to run, and that system can't keep up with ATP demands, we start to get close to what's called the aerobic threshold by some, or we could call it the first lactate threshold or first ventilatory threshold. So your body starts to realize that, hey, we need to get energy moving a little bit faster. So the first thing that happens is you're going to start to release epinephrine, so adrenaline, and that's going to start to drive some changes around the top of zone 2. We're going to start to ramp up a little bit. We're going to start to increase the amount of fast twitch fiber we're utilizing. We're going to start to burn through glycogen, so that's stored form of carbohydrate. And then some people might call that anaerobic metabolism. I just prefer saying glycolytic, cycle through glycogen. And the implications of that are, we're starting to deplete our energy reserves because we can only store so much glycogen versus fat. Fat's pretty like unlimited. You could run 5 marathons in a row without eating. You'd be totally fine. Or, in your world, probably hike a whole big mountain just off. So that intensity around that aerobic threshold, so the separation point between zone 2 heart rate and zone 3 heart rate, is very important for mountaineers and ultra marathoners, cyclists, all those endurance athletes, because they're not going to be exercising at intensities much higher than that threshold. So they typically want to have that threshold occur at as high of an intensity as possible so that they're not going to, just be walking and starting to tap into their glycogen reserves and starting to accumulate lactate, which starts to happen at that threshold as well. So I mentioned lactate is starting to accumulate. So we can't go on without talking about something called the lactate shuttle. So lactate itself is this molecule that's going to be it's essentially it's a byproduct of burning through carbohydrates. The only difference is that, so when we have a carbohydrate molecule, it's a 6-carbon molecule. You go through glycolysis, you get 2 ATP or 3 ATP if it's glycogen.
I'm just like having all these memories of like biology in college. I love it. And I
So,
actually, what a nerd I am in college, I had a coloring book
oh, nice.
that like you could like color all these pathways. So I was actually flashing back to my.
When we're going through glycolysis, burning through a glucose, or it would be called glycogenolysis if you're burning through glycogen, you're essentially splitting that molecule in half. You're getting some ATP, and then you're getting 2 lactate molecules. So those
So you're getting some energy, but also this waste as well.
Yep. And for reference, let's say if you were going to burn a glucose molecule aerobically, so instead of it turning into lactate, it could go into the mitochondria, you might get up to maybe 36 ATP versus only 2 ATP from that anaerobic pathway. So it's a much different energy like amount that you're getting from that, but it's happening much quicker. So,
and you get more of it aerobically because there's less energy needed to actually break apart those molecules. Why is that?
Let's say we have that glucose or glycogen molecule. Let's just say glucose, and you're at a low intensity, so like zone 1 or zone 2, and glucose, instead of turning into lactate, it's going to turn into pyruvate. And then pyruvate is going to enter into the mitochondria where we'll have the Krebs cycle and then the electron transport chain. So this is just additional ATP that you're producing aerobically. But like I said before, it happens much slower. So if your exercise intensity is high, that's when your body is like, all right, we need to start moving through these carbohydrates quicker. And we're going to start going into lactate. So going back into lactate is going to essentially bind to some acid molecules, so some hydrogen that's building up, released from glycolysis. And then you have this lactate molecule, and it's normally being, let's say, produced in fast twitch fibers. And once it's produced, most people think of lactate as that kind of metabolic garbage, that like thing that's causing fatigue in your legs. But yeah, totally. Once we have that lactate, it's actually something that we can reuse as a fuel source or substrate. That lactate in that fast twitch fiber is going to be shuttled to maybe an adjacent slow twitch fiber. So let's say that fast twitch fiber is in your quad, you're running uphill, and then lactate spills into the bloodstream, and then a slow twitch fiber is going to take that lactate up and actually use it in the same way that we would bring glucose or pyruvate into the mitochondria. So we can actually reuse it as a fuel source, which I think is really cool. There's even been studies that have shown that, just to kind of disprove the lactate causing fatigue phenomenon, that let's say you're going to inject yourself with lactate, or maybe have a sports drink that you're drinking that has lactate in it, you'll actually see performance improve because it's just like taking in carbohydrates. That lactate's going to enter into a slow twitch muscle fiber. Like I said, that could be adjacent to that producing fast twitch fiber, or it could be distant. So you might have a less active muscle fiber somewhere in the body that's going to see that lactate and say, hey, that's fuel. We're going to use that. My favorite example of that is the heart. So our heart is 100% slow twitch muscle fiber. It's made to just contract all day without stopping. Once you get to an intensity that's above zone 2, where you're starting to accumulate some lactate in the blood, your heart is actually going to take up lactate, and it's going to be the only fuel source that your heart's going to use. So it actually prefers lactate over glucose to keep running. So I think that part of it's really cool, and it has a lot of implications on how we train.
So a lot of people say lactic acid, which is actually not accurate, right? Why is it that you think there's this misnomer, this misconception about it being lactic acid that's the byproduct and that's building up in our muscles?
Yeah, so a little bit of like history on lactate. So in the early 20th century, there was this famous physiologist named A.V. Hill, and he essentially discovered that lactate was accumulating in muscle fibers that were starting to fatigue. So it was a funny experiment where he had a frog leg, and he contracted the frog leg until it started to fatigue. He also had that frog leg or those muscle fibers in a hypoxic environment, so there was not oxygen present. And he basically measured the muscle fibers and said, oh, its fibers are fatigued. There's a lot of lactate. So lactate must have caused that fatigue. Over 100 years, a lot of people have just kind of stopped the conversation of our bioenergetics that lactate's high, there's fatigue, so there must be a correlation. At the time, that scientists just didn't have all the resources that we have today to study lactate. And actually interesting too, to like think about, when lactate's produced in the muscle fiber, it actually acts more like a buffer than an actual like acid buildup. So lactate's role is actually to take that hydrogen or that acid that's being built up and remove it from a muscle cell. So if we didn't have lactate, we'd have all this acidity building up within a muscle fiber. So it's important, like we can't really do high intensity exercise without lactate.
And I think a lot of people, I think lactate gets a bad name sometimes. I think a lot of people don't realize that that shuttle exists and it can be turned into fuel. And people think that if they're exercising at a high intensity and they're leaving some lactate behind, that it's a bad thing. And it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where this is why endurance athletes are so amazing, is because they can produce a lot of lactate, and then they have all these slow twitch muscle fibers that are ready to take lactate and then use it up. But if you had we'll get into some of this when I talk about testing a bit more, but if you have more of a fast twitch athlete, they have the same amount of slow twitch muscle fiber, mitochondrial density. So they might be producing lactate, but they might not be able to shuttle it and then recycle it quite as easily. So they might have to deal they can't really recover quite as well as an endurance athlete for that reason.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So you have this information now. Oh, I've seen the spreadsheet that you output as a result of these testing, very thorough. And then how do you use that information then to design or make recommendations for an endurance athlete?
Maybe I'll just back up a little bit and talk about that second
Yeah.
lactate threshold. So that'll give us
Oh,
kind of
yes. Please. Yes. Yes.
oh yeah,
Yes.
no problem. So
Yep.
I'll give us kind of a full picture of how I set my training zones. So we talked about zone 1, zone 2, and then that first lactate threshold. So sometimes people call that the aerobic threshold. So when we're getting into zone 3 and zone 4, lactate's starting to accumulate in the bloodstream, and we'll actually start to see fat oxidation drop off. So
Mhm.
lactate will actually inhibit the release of free fatty acids. So we'll see carbohydrates increasing, fats decreasing, and then obviously the intensity is getting a bit harder. And we get to this point where the lactate shuttle is like it's shuttling lactate as fast as it can. It's kind of maxed out at how much lactate it can move and recycle. So at that point, since intensity is continuing to increase, we'll see lactate start to rise exponentially, or it'll really start to just kind of exponentially rise. As a result, we'll start to breathe a bit harder and kind of pass that second threshold. It's been called our anaerobic threshold, or our second lactate threshold, or second ventilatory threshold, a lot of different names for it. After that point, lactate's really starting to accumulate. This might be around a lactate level between 3 and 6 millimole. Once we push a little bit higher into zone 5, we'll see lactate rise even more. So that second threshold, along with the first threshold, are very important for me when I'm looking at someone's profile. So I might look at the VO2 at each threshold. So let's say someone's VO2 max is, I don't know, 50 milliliters per kilogram, and their first lactate threshold, where it first starts to rise up, that might happen at, let's say, 35 milliliter kilogram. So that's what, 70% or so of their max. And then their second threshold, I'll look at their VO2, and let's say it's at 45 milliliters per kilogram. So that might be at 90% of their VO2 max.
Right.
So I like to kind of know, where are these thresholds occurring relative to someone's VO2 max? And I see a pretty wide variance there. Someone's first threshold, I might see between 50 and maybe 75% of someone's VO2 max. And that second threshold might be maybe 75 to 90% of someone's VO2 max. And those are, within that continuum, those are much different profiles. So I'm testing like let's say a mountaineer or a traditional endurance athlete. They tend to have their thresholds at really high percentages of their VO2 max. Whereas, like, I've tested middle distance runners, their event might last like 2 minutes, maybe 4 minutes. Or let's say CrossFit athletes. So, like, let's say like endurance athlete, but they do a lot of high intensity. We
Yeah.
might see those thresholds at lower percentiles. So that first threshold might happen at 50%, and that second threshold might happen at maybe 75%. So that's all kind of dependent on the types of training they do. So that it's basically like relative fitness. So how much of your VO2 max can you actually use before we start to see those changes in metabolism happen?
And that's a matter of them not training those systems. They're just not efficient yet at using the amount of available oxygen they have in order to create fuel and sustain that activity.
Yeah, so if you think about that, like CrossFit athlete or middle distance runner, their sports require high degrees of glycolytic activity and fast twitch
Right.
fiber. So they probably just have a smaller percent of their total muscle fiber as slow twitch. Like right around 50% of VO2 max, they're going to start to already recruit fast twitch fiber, and they're going to have elevated lactate in those low intensity ranges typically.
Yeah. And we can adapt that. We can change it over time by training in certain ways.
Right. And then, so kind of going back to like the physiology profile, might be interesting to talk about some variations in lactate that we see. Very dependent on how I'm going to train someone. Like, let's say I'm testing a really well trained Nordic skier. So these are some of the best like aerobic
Yeah.
engines in the world.
Crazy fit.
Yeah, they're just training all year nonstop. So they do a really high volume of training. So they might train 6, 7, 800 hours a year at low intensity. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a lot of time, and they're spending that time just doing repeated contractions of their slow twitch muscle fiber, burning fat, all those things we've talked about. So when I'm doing a lactate test on them, and they're in, let's say, zone 1 or zone 2, they're going to have really low levels of lactate. So I might see lactate levels below 1 millimole, and their first lactate threshold might happen even below 1.5 millimole, whereas
Wow.
general population, just normal fit people, will see lactate values at that first threshold around 2 millimole. So
Wow.
big difference there. And then going back into that kind of CrossFit or high intensity athlete we're talking about, I've seen essentially baseline lactate values. So, just conversational pace running, it's all the way at 3 millimole. So, huge difference in how they're producing energy to meet those, exercise intensity domains.
That's fascinating to me.
Yeah, so it's just like totally different. And so it's all kind of dependent on the type of training, as you alluded to, like where they're spending their time. And at the end of the test, so someone's at VO2 max, they're falling off the treadmill, yeah, breathing real hard. Yeah, totally. So I like to also look at how high someone's lactate gets at the end of a test. So normally someone will, be at VO2 max and their lactate level might be between, let's say, 6 and 8 millimole of lactate. For that really well-trained endurance athlete, it's going to be very dependent on the types of intensity they train at. So if I'm
Mm-hmm.
testing like an ultra marathoner, doesn't really dip into zone 5 too much, they might end the test at maybe 4, maybe at most 6 millimole of lactate, versus, let's say I'm testing like a mountain biker who's a great aerobic engine but much better at sprinting. They
Mm-hmm.
might end the test at 10, 12, 13 millimoles of lactate. So they're doubling how much output they can produce anaerobically from that lactate producing system. So it's fascinating to see like all these different profiles that are going to be
Yeah.
dependent on, like we've said, genetics, but also dependent on the types of training someone's doing.
And so then let's say someone comes to you, we'll use the mountaineering example again. They want to begin training as an endurance athlete, but their systems are not optimized to do that. So what do you prescribe for them, or what do you do with this data that helps them get the most out of their training?
I think like whenever we're talking about training design, we need to really understand what they're training for. So like,
Mm-hmm.
you could describe this much better than me as a mountaineer. Like, how many hours does it take to like get up there to
Yeah.
that peak, and like at what intensities are you training at? So once
Right.
you know that information, you can think about, all right, what energy systems need to be maximized? What should someone's slow twitch versus fast twitch distribution look like? And then really important, what fuel sources are going to be most
Mm-hmm.
important for that person to work.
Yep.
So going into that kind of mountaineering example, let's say someone's in zone 1, zone 2 during a test, and their lactate levels are above 2 millimole. So to me, that person is likely maybe a little bit too much fast twitch dominant, and they're going to be relying a little bit too much on their glycolytic energy system. So that person gets the exciting news that they need to do a lot of really low intensity
Low
training.
intensity. Yeah, I would imagine that's a pretty common scenario,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
Because I think we have been taught that if we're not training unless we're going all out and like giving it 110%. There's this misperception. I think it's changing, that we have to give it all every time and be like
Yeah,
at high heart rate levels, about to vomit in a bucket in the corner of the gym for us to make any progress in terms of
right.
training. And it's goal dependent, but for people who have endurance goals, that's absolutely not the way you should be training.
Correct. Yeah. And it's funny when you have that profile, you tell them, hey, I want you to go and
Yeah,
keep
dial
your
it
heart
back.
rate below this number. A lot of times they're like, I don't feel like I'm doing anything.
I get that, not so much anymore, but still occasionally someone's like, this isn't working. Like
Yeah.
my heart rate is, and it's just how we've been conditioned, how we've defined what training is. And the other thing I, if we have time, we could talk about is how people all often want to know what's the right heart rate for my aerobic threshold. Like they
Yeah.
think there's a secret number, and if it's below this, it's bad, and if it's above that, it's good. And everyone's physiology is different.
Correct. Yeah. And that's like a big reason people come in to test with me. So let's say they get a fitness watch and it's telling them your zone 2 is at these numbers.
Yep.
And how it's doing that is it's taking the person's age and predicting their max heart rate. So it might say 220 minus your age, and that's your max. And then you're taking percentages of that max number to set, your training zones.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually a really poor correlation between age and heart rate max.
Yes.
So
And I've even heard that 220 minus your age was based on like male college athletes. Like it doesn't even represent a real population of people, but it's
most
very commonly
exercise
used still.
science research is on that
Yeah.
population, and I think it's starting to get better with like more females and different ages and stuff like that. But yeah, you got to be skeptical when you're looking at this stuff. And it's funny, and even on the opposite end of the spectrum, like some people might come in and maybe they do a field test, or they try to figure out what their zone 2 is because they've heard that important. So some people will find that they have to briskly walk to be in zone
Right.
2 to hit a certain number, and
Yep.
they'll actually start to detrain because they're not getting enough of exercise stress. They'll sign up for a test with me, and maybe they thought their top of zone 2 was 140 beats per minute, and then they learn their real top of zone 2 based off of the lactate and VO2 numbers we are talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's up near 160 beats per minute. So it can be very important to get that dialed in if you plan to like actually go off some numbers, and yeah, just making it specific to how your body's working.
Yeah, totally. What are some common mistakes or deficiencies that you often see in people that come into your lab?
That's a good question. We've already kind of touched on like, instead of doing enough like real low intensity training,
Mhm.
spending too much time at kind of that middle zone, so zone 3, zone 4. So with that type of training, I guess I can expand on that. So if you're going on most of your easy endurance runs or bike rides or whatever it might be, and you're spending a lot of time in that zone 3, zone 4, you're essentially spreading the stress from exercise across all of your energy systems, or most of being true stimulus into just your slow twitch or just your fast twitch if you're doing some high intensity efforts. So that's definitely a big part of it, is just like, yeah, just kind of like easy should be easy. And then I also see some people not actually doing the hard stuff. Yeah, I mean, there's been this huge movement recently of like, you got to do your zone 2, you got to do some of it. If your goals require doing some high intensity efforts and you're not training your glycolytic system, you're kind of like not thinking about it in a specific manner of how you're training. So sometimes you'll see people that like let's say they want to be able to run uphill. So they're a trail runner and they're doing all this like low intensity training, and they're
Yeah.
seeing some progress, but they're not working at those upper intensities. Also be very effective for moving those thresholds to a higher percent of VO2 max,
Yep.
because you're introducing some lactate and some stress into the system. So your body has to learn to recover and buffer any of those waste products that are building up. So you got to do the low intensity, but if your goals require, pushing your effort up, do some high intensity intervals too.
Yeah, I agree, especially with intervals. I think they're very potent for a lot of goals and for a lot of reasons. Do you find I tend to not put someone into interval training right away. I feel like they need a good aerobic base first. Do you think is that what you've seen as well?
Yeah. So I guess if you're working with someone that's relatively untrained, this actually goes off of like some clinical like exercise prescription protocols that we might
Okay.
do with, someone that's a bit unhealthy. So we usually will spend a month, maybe 2 months doing training that's below that first threshold to get their aerobic fitness up a bit. Totally. And then I usually like to take what's called like a pyramidal approach. So this is the planning of training variables, where after they've done some aerobic base training, I'll start to incorporate some zone 3, maybe some zone 4 intensity, where they can kind of just like experience working through some of that buildup of those waste products.
Yep.
And then that might be for another couple weeks or a couple months. Eventually we might start working towards, doing some zone 5 intervals or some spirals. So it's usually kind of like working your way up a staircase, gradually getting them used to intensity versus like day one, like we're doing,
Sprint uphill.
all day.
Yeah, I would probably get fired as a coach if
Yeah.
that happened. Well, you mentioned running uphill, and I know you've done a lot of research recently on vertical running economy, which we didn't get a chance to talk about when you and I spoke initially. So I'm really curious about what that is and what that means and what your research has shown you.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks for asking. So when we're looking at physiologic testing data, we're getting a VO2 response to intensity. So when we think about economy, it's essentially a metric of how much energy you're using to exercise at a specific pace or output. So traditionally, running economy will be measured on a treadmill where you might have someone running at a set pace for a couple minutes, and you're looking at how much oxygen did it require for them to run at that pace. So I always tell people like, I might have a similar VO2 max to like a East African elite marathoner, but if I went for a
Right.
run with someone like that, they would drop me instantly because I'm not a fast swimmer. So they would have really high running economy, very efficient at maintaining that pace. Whereas I'm just like, I'm more of a cyclist, mountain biker, and I certainly like to run, but I can't hold like a 6-minute mile and hold a conversation. So that like test or that measurement has always been, looked at a flat running surface and like normative data for running economy. Someone with like really high running economy, they're gonna basically be able to run. Let me back up. So it's measured as usually milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per kilometer.
Okay. Per kilometer. So it's adding one more element to how we measure VO2 max.
Yeah. So, they can run a kilometer very fast at a low
Yep.
VO2 if their running
Right.
economy is high. So I got into this from a interesting perspective where, living in Bozeman, there's thousands of trail runners. Like that's kind of the main sport here. I have a big data set of people I've tested over the last several years. I'm looking at a vertical test. And I've always kind of felt like, it'd be nice to have running economy as part of that test. Look at those numbers because we're doing a vertical test. Since trail running as a sport has been growing in popularity, there's been a lot of new research coming out trying to understand the determinants of performance. These studies are interesting where they'll have people come into a lab and they'll measure their VO2 max, their lactate thresholds, running economy. and then they'll set them out to do like a race or like a time trial or something like that. And then with some statistics, they'll say, all right, your race performance is highly correlated with VO2 max or lactate threshold, things like that. So there's been a few studies coming out in the ultra running space, and this is kind of like mountain running, where the authors have essentially concluded that running economy does not matter for ultra marathon performance. And I look at that, that's interesting. Like, you would think that expending less energy to run a certain pace would be advantageous for running long distances. And so I started looking at their methods of like how they were, measuring running economy. And one of the studies, I think that came out in 2020, they basically just had participants run on a flat treadmill at their half marathon speed of their running economy. And they basically found there was no correlation between economy and then their ability to run a trail running race. And I asked the question of like, are we measuring this correctly? Like,
Right.
does this measurement represent the demands of this sport? Started to compile like my data set of all these vertical VO2 max, lactate threshold tests I've done. And I created a metric, and it might exist already, I'm not sure, but the idea is vertical running economy. On a treadmill, we can predict someone's vertical feet per hour, incline and speed. So what we did, let me back up a little bit. Since the normal metric is running how much VO2 you're using per kilometer, I'm going to set it to 300 meters or 1,000 feet. So how much oxygen does someone require to run uphill in that like vertical distance? And for me, I wanted to see like, is there actual variation across my data set? And this kind of came from just observing over time that some people would come in and test with me, and they would have a pretty good VO2 max. Like, they might have a VO2 max in the 50s or maybe the low to mid 60s, but they're not really running uphill very fast. So I see that as being like, oh, like they're just not very economical.
Efficient.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I basically started compiling some normative data. And one of the things that I found was super interesting was looking at economy at each threshold and at their VO2 max. So reporting is like at LT1, so zone 2, give or take, what is their vertical speed? So are they going 500 vertical feet per hour, 1,000 vertical feet per hour, 100? And I did a little bit of what's called regression statistics and compared a group of people and who had similar VO2 max values. So they all kind of had VO2 max around, let's say, 60 to 65. VO2 at their first threshold was between 40 and 45 milliliters per kilogram. So since that first threshold really represents ultra marathoners and mountaineers and things like that, I basically saw that there was a 1,000 vertical feet per hour difference at LT1 between someone with low vertical economy and someone with high vertical economy.
1,000 feet an hour.
Mm-hmm.
That's huge.
Yeah. And for me, like when I'm working with trail runners, that might be a difference between someone being able to run uphill and having to walk when they get to like hills. So I thought that was super fascinating. And yeah, it's just like one of those things where like I want to push the research field that's looking into these things to say like, do we need a different metric for understanding economy when it comes to, exercising in the mountains versus like a road runner, which that's all of our data is kind of backed on that.
Totally. I mean, it seems very logical when you lay it out that way, that we need a better metric.
Yeah. And then a little bit more on that project. So I was curious about certain physiologic metrics that helped us explain vertical feet per hour at certain intensities. So going back to some of that research, it's kind of similar statistics where they're like, all right, VO2 max is the best predictor of all the measures for race performance. So my like outcome metric was just like, all right, how fast uphill are they running at each threshold in VO2 max. So I basically did some statistics to understand which variables are helping us predict good economy, or let's say fast uphill running versus uphill running. And I can kind of jump into that some of that stuff. A few things. So the variables that jumped out the most for that specifically vertical speed per hour at LT1, one was VO2 max. So that's our engine size. And then the second one was VO2 at LT1. So some people in the data set, like we were talking about before, their VO2 at LT1 might be down at 50% of max. Some might be up at 70%. So the type of training that's going to push that is obviously a high volume of low intensity, putting your hours in. And then the third metric that I thought was really interesting was how low could someone's lactate. So if someone wanted to run above 1,000 vertical feet per hour at LT1, they need to have their lactate below 2 millimole. I mentioned there was some people who would be above 2 millimole. None of them were able to run above 1,000 vertical feet per hour. If you wanted to get above 1,500 vertical per hour at LT1, I believe you had to get below 1.5 or maybe even 1 millimole for like your lowest lactate value, which tells us that this is super important if you're wanting to run uphill, efficiently, is to really get that low intensity training in, thus keep lactate values low, going back to that lactate shuttle and improving fat oxidation. So all that stuff is super helpful for running uphill at that specific intensity.
Wow. That makes me feel a lot better, actually. I'm pretty good at low intensity, high volume stuff.
Yeah, it makes sense with like the training that you're doing and what you're preparing for. And then like the shorter the event is, so that's when VO2 max is going to matter more. So in trail running, there's an event called a vertical kilometer. We have one of these in Big Sky. It's called the Rut. Yeah, as fast as they can, straight up, and then the race ends at the top. So there's been some research showing, like, if you want to win one of those races at a national level, you probably need to have your VO2 max as a male above 80 milliliters per kilogram. And then for females, above 75 milliliters per kilogram. Yeah, obviously more important for VO2 max for those shorter events. But for those longer ones, it seems like VO2 max matters less. So I would suggest it's probably having to do with that economy and how high you can get your VO2 at LT1.
Right. Fascinating. It's been a long time. I probably should have it done again. And so one of your goals starting your company was to make that testing more accessible to people. So what are you doing in that vein to, I think, first of all, doing talks like this makes it a lot easier to understand for people. So thank you for taking the time.
Yeah. So for a long time, testing was really only available at university labs. And over the last few years, just the equipment coming out, less focused on research and more on just like commercial grade testing. So I use metabolic testing system called VO2 Master. And basically like anyone in the community can reach out to work with me. Like you don't have to be part of a research study or anything like that. And then just making the cost of testing more accessible was huge so that like it's not just reserved for like the select few like elite athletes or whatever. And just kind of like getting this information out is important to me because I find it to be very actionable. And I think like most people for a long time just thought like, oh, VO2 max, that's cool, but like, what do I do with that information? So I've really worked hard to refine my testing and reporting system to make sure people are getting as much as they can out of that process. And yeah, I think it's going to grow more and more the more accessible this information and just more people that are trained and actually doing the testing. I think that's just as important. Go somewhere and get a test, but it might be, poor equipment or the interpretation might be
Or it's
Um,
just use I've seen some really bad ones. I like that's my advice is and what I tell athletes is to like check out the lab before you go, make sure they're used to working with athletes and ask for a copy,
yeah,
just a generic copy of what you'll get at the conclusion of your test because I get some things sent to me. I'm like, this doesn't help me at
right,
all. Like,
yeah.
yeah. So thank you for making it simple and understandable and making sure people get the most out of it. What are you up to personally now? Do you have big goals that are on the horizon for you or something that you're training for?
Yeah, big thing for me is just having fun and like enjoying. And yeah, so like winter is sort of wrapping up here in Montana. I just got back from an awesome ski trip to British
Ooh,
Columbia. Great ski touring, which was super fun. So we kind of had like a dry winter here. So my
yeah.
stoke and excitement for skiing was not quite there. And then went up to Canada and I was like, oh man, I want to ski more. So I'll probably get a couple more days just doing some peaks, yeah, skiing some good spring conditions, and then yeah, I have like a couple of races this summer,
Cool.
both gravel and some mountain bike races I'll do just locally, and then yeah, I just like having fun. So I think a big
So
thing with endurance training is just like enjoying the process, um, and just like being excited to go ride my bike. I don't really like to push myself to the point of it feeling like work. So I like to just make sure I'm having fun and doing it with friends.
love that. Anything else that you want to make sure we share with people in this episode?
Yeah, we have an Instagram, just at Calibrated Coaching. There's some kind of cool stuff on there that we've done. Like there's like some field testing we work on. So basically bringing the equipment outside of the lab, and that's been a
Mhm.
cool part of the equipment that we have is we can bring it different places and do some
That's great.
testing. So yeah, there's like some videos and stuff like that on the Instagram.
Well, we'll be sure to check it out. And I really encourage people to check out your website, really study this podcast. There's a lot of really good, important, like easy to implement information here and to reach out to myself or Tom with questions. And if you're in Bozeman, please check out your lab so you can get a real, like, useful performance metabolic testing done.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, certainly reach out with
So
questions.
thanks.